The barracks smelled of pine wood and damp earth. Female Japanese prisoners, still in shock from capture, were marched inside at dusk. Their uniforms were ragged, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and fear. They expected darkness, cold, perhaps chains on the floor. Instead, rows of wooden bunks lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and folded blanket. The sight alone unsettled them. It looked almost civilized. But then came the greater shock. As the women hesitated by the bunks, American soldiers entered with their own gear. Without hesitation, they placed bedrolls on the floor and sat down, preparing to sleep in the same room. A wave of panic swept through the prisoners. Whispers broke out. Were they to be humiliated? Violated? Their commanders had told them that capture meant dishonor, that American men were beasts who would strip them of dignity. Yet the soldiers did nothing. They set down rifles, unbuttoned jackets, and stretched out on the planks beside the bunks. A few muttered quietly to one another, their voices low, tired, almost indifferent. The young women watched, stiff with terror. Every movement of the men felt threatening, even when it was harmless. One soldier removed his boots, sighing with relief. Another leaned back against his pack and closed his eyes. Still, no order was given, no cruelty shown. Instead of separate worlds, guard and captive, they found themselves sharing the same silence, the same room, the same night. The nurse who sat closest to the doorway clutched her blanket tightly. She had been prepared to fight, to resist, but nothing happened. The soldiers lay still, drifting toward sleep like weary farmers after harvest. The sound unsettled her most, the soft rhythm of American breathing. In her mind, these were enemies, killers. Yet now their breath filled the room like an ordinary lullaby. She wondered, if they were truly monsters, why would they sleep beside prisoners without fear? Why not chain them or lock them in a separate barracks? The question gnawed at her, louder than any shouted order could have been. Around her, other women whispered, their voices trembling. "What do they want?" one asked. Another shook her head in silence. None had an answer. The irony struck her as she lay down. She was more afraid of the quiet than of any violence. Because in the quiet, she realized something far more dangerous than cruelty. She realized the Americans trusted them. And trust, she knew, was something her own commanders had never given. That first night, lying awake with American soldiers asleep just a few feet away, she felt her world tilt into strangeness. The war had taught her to expect fear. Instead, captivity gave her confusion. The night grew colder. The barracks walls creaked as the wind pressed against them, carrying the faint scent of pine smoke from the distant campfire. Inside, the silence deepened. The Japanese women lay stiff on their bunks, blankets pulled tight. Their eyes darted to the shadows where the Americans rested. Some soldiers snored lightly, others shifted in their sleep, their rifles stacked neatly against the wall. Whispers spread among the prisoners, sharp and urgent. "It is a trick," one hissed. "They wait until we sleep." Another muttered, "They will dishonor us before morning." The words carried the weight of fear that training had drilled into them. Bushido had not prepared them for this, the enemy lying peacefully only arm's length away. Their commanders had warned them. Americans were ruthless, their camps filled with cruelty. Yet here, nothing happened. The young nurse, who had been bandaged earlier, pressed her face into the rough cotton pillow, listening to the men breathe. They sounded tired, not dangerous. But suspicion clung to her chest like a stone. One soldier stirred, turning onto his side. The scrape of fabric echoed like thunder in the tense room. Every prisoner froze. Hearts pounded. But the man only settled deeper into sleep, sighing softly, as though oblivious to the women's fear. Minutes stretched like hours. Some women kept their eyes wide open, watching the shadows. Others feigned sleep but trembled beneath their blankets. No guard shouted orders. No punishment fell. Only the quiet rhythm of shared exhaustion. The contradiction gnawed at them. If the Americans meant harm, why wait? Why offer food earlier, or bandages, or warm beds? Nothing fit the picture painted by their officers. Slowly, the unease shifted into a new question, whispered silently across the bunks. What if they are not what we were told? That thought was dangerous, almost forbidden. To believe the enemy could be human was to betray years of belief. Yet in the dark, with nothing but steady breathing and silence for proof, the question refused to die. The nurse turned her head slightly. Through the dim light, she saw one soldier sleeping with an arm across his chest, his face softened by exhaustion. He looked less like a monster, more like a brother or a farmer from her village. Her heart pounded harder at the thought, not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that she had seen him as human. She shut her eyes, ashamed, yet unable to erase the image. That night, she did not sleep. She lay awake between two worlds, the one she had been taught, and the one unfolding before her eyes. And as the hours passed, suspicion did not fade. It transformed into something far more unsettling. Curiosity. What else had been a lie? The first pale light of dawn crept through the wooden slats of the barracks. Roosters crowed faintly from a nearby farm, mingling with the sound of boots crunching outside. The prisoners stirred, rubbing sleep from their swollen eyes. The Japanese women rose hesitantly, expecting harsh orders or punishment for some invisible offense. Yet when they looked around, they froze. The American soldiers were still there, rolling up bedrolls, tightening belts, yawning like men returning from a long shift. Not one of them had touched the women during the night. Not one had spoken a word of cruelty. They had simply slept, sharing the same room as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. For the prisoners, it was anything but ordinary. Their commanders had sworn the Americans would treat them like property, worse than animals. Yet here they were, waking beside men who looked at them with no malice, only the same groggy fatigue shared by every soldier at dawn. One guard stretched his arms, glanced at the women, and offered a small nod before stepping outside. Another chuckled softly as he pulled on his boots, saying something in English the prisoners could not understand. His tone, however, was unmistakable. It carried no hatred. The young nurse sat on the edge of her bunk, staring down at her hands. She had braced herself all night for violence, humiliation, or ridicule. Instead, she had been given silence. The absence of cruelty struck her harder than cruelty itself. Beside her, another woman whispered, "Why did they sleep here?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one could answer. Breakfast came next, trays of eggs, bread, and steaming mugs of coffee. The guards ate the same food, sitting side by side with their captives. No special rations, no division. The women stared in disbelief, their suspicion crumbling one bite at a time. Still, unease lingered. Was this kindness real, or just the first step in some unseen cruelty? They did not know. But when the nurse lifted her mug, the bitter warmth of coffee slid down her throat, and she realized something terrifying. She wanted to believe it was real. That morning, the women exchanged glances, filled not with fear, but with confusion. They had survived the first night untouched, and in that survival lay a new danger: doubt. Because if the Americans were not monsters, then what else had been a lie? The war outside the wire continued, but inside the barracks, the greatest battle was now within their minds. The barracks settled into a rhythm over the following days. At night, The Americans unrolled their bedrolls on the floor, and the women returned to their bunks. By morning, they all rose together, the routine repeating like clockwork. Yet each repetition only deepened the strangeness. The women had braced themselves for cruelty. Instead, they found themselves sharing silence, meals, and sleep under the same roof as the very men they had been taught to fear most. Suspicion lingered. One prisoner tucked her blanket tightly around herself each night, convinced the guards were only waiting for the right moment. Another whispered prayers under her breath, asking her ancestors for strength against dishonor. But the dishonor never came. The Americans laughed softly among themselves, swapped cigarettes, and drifted into slumber without so much as a glance toward the women. The shocking normalcy gnawed at the captives. The nurse studied them closely. One soldier always removed his boots carefully, setting them neatly at his side before lying down. Another slept curled on his pack, arms crossed, his face boyish in the dim light. They did not look like predators. They looked ordinary. That realization was dangerous. To see them as human was to betray everything she had been taught. Yet each night, as fear failed to materialize, her certainty began to erode. Still, trust did not come easily. When one soldier coughed in his sleep, a wave of panic jolted through the bunks. When another shifted positions, several women froze in terror. But the moments passed, and nothing happened. The silence became louder than words. It forced questions into their minds. If these men were their enemies, why did they sleep so vulnerably in the same room? Why risk lying down beside women they had captured? The answer was unspoken but clear. The Americans did not see them as threats. And in that quiet dismissal, there was a strange kind of respect, recognition that they were human, not trophies. For the women, the contradiction was unbearable. They had expected brutality, yet were given indifference mixed with fragments of kindness. The war had promised monsters. Instead, they found tired young men who simply wanted to sleep. The nurse lay awake one night, staring at the beams above her head. She realized that fear had given way to something even more dangerous: curiosity. What did these soldiers think of them? Did they see them as enemies, or simply as women caught in the same storm of war? No answer came. Only the rhythm of shared breathing in the dark. But for the first time, she found herself drifting into uneasy sleep, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet realization that perhaps captivity was not the end she had been taught to fear. It was something far stranger, a world where enemy and prisoner slept side by side, and the boundaries between them blurred a little more each night. By the end of the first week, the silence in the barracks had changed. What began as tension, thick with fear, now carried an undercurrent of something else, an awareness that both sides were watching each other more closely. The Japanese women whispered less at night. Instead, their eyes followed the American soldiers as they laid out their bedrolls. They studied the way one man rubbed his temples before lying down, the way another muttered a prayer in English, his lips barely moving. The Americans, too, began to notice. They caught the quick glances from the bunks, the way the prisoners' shoulders tensed whenever someone shifted in sleep. Some of the soldiers exchanged smirks, not mocking, but amused by the nervousness that lingered despite so many uneventful nights. The nurse felt the weight of those glances more than anyone. She remembered one evening when a soldier yawned, stretched, and accidentally met her eyes across the dim room. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he smiled faintly, almost apologetically, before rolling over. Her chest tightened. It was not cruelty. It was not even dominance. It was acknowledgement. That small, fleeting smile unsettled her, more than a rifle ever could. Around her, The other women whispered of their own observations. "They sleep like us," one said. Another added, "One of them snores louder than my father." Laughter bubbled briefly, nervous but real. It shocked them as much as any kindness. Each night became a kind of unspoken dialogue. The women listened to the rhythm of American snores, the rustle of blankets, the occasional sigh of exhaustion. The men, in turn, seemed to sense the prisoners' fear softening, though no words crossed between them. This strange intimacy, born not of touch or conversation, but of proximity, grew with every passing day. They were enemies, yet they shared the same four walls, the same stale air, the same fragile vulnerability of sleep. For the nurse, it was unbearable. She wanted to hate them as she had been taught, yet night after night she found herself listening to their breathing, steady and human. And each time she did, her certainty slipped further away. One evening, as a soldier removed his boots and winced at a blister, she caught herself thinking of her brother who had marched barefoot across volcanic rock in the Pacific. The comparison stung. She clenched her blanket and turned away. But the thought lingered. Enemies or not, these men were not so different from the ones she had loved and lost. That realization haunted her more than fear ever could. Because in the silence of those nights, she realized she was not only surviving, she was beginning unwillingly to see the humanity of her captors. The sixth night began like all the others. The soldiers filed in after their shifts, setting down rifles and bedrolls with the same quiet routine. The women retreated to their bunks, pulling blankets tight around their shoulders, pretending not to watch. But something shifted that night. One soldier fumbled with his gear, dropping a small tin cup onto the wooden floor. The sharp clang echoed through the barracks, startling everyone into a moment of frozen silence. Then, unexpectedly, one of the women let out a short, nervous laugh. It escaped before she could stop herself, a laugh and a half born of tension, half absurdity. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock, eyes wide as though she had just committed a crime. The soldier paused, looked at the cup, then at her. Instead of anger, he grinned sheepishly, shrugged, and picked it up. To everyone's surprise, he gave a playful little bow, as if mocking his own clumsiness. The barracks erupted, not in chaos, but in muffled laughter, first among the prisoners, then even among the soldiers. For the first time, the two groups shared a sound that was not fear, not suspicion, but something startlingly human. The nurse sat frozen, her heart racing. Laughter in captivity felt dangerous, forbidden. Yet she could not stop the small smile pulling at her lips. It was as if the air itself had shifted, lighter now, less suffocating. After that night, the silence of the barracks changed. It no longer pressed like a weight. Instead, it carried an undercurrent of possibility. The women began to whisper less of danger and more of curiosity. The soldiers, too, seemed to relax, their movements less guarded. Small moments followed. One prisoner sneezed in the dark, and a soldier muttered something in English that sounded suspiciously like, "Bless you." Another night, a guard hummed softly to himself, a tune unfamiliar to the women, but strangely soothing. Each gesture chipped at the invisible wall that separated captor from captive. The women still feared dishonor. The soldiers still carried rifles. Yet beneath those roles, something undeniable stirred. Recognition. The nurse lay awake long after the laughter had faded, staring at the beams above. She realized she was no longer waiting for cruelty. She was waiting for something else, something she dared not name. For the first time since her capture, she allowed herself to wonder, what if kindness could exist even here in the shadow of barbed wire? The thought terrified her. Because if kindness was possible, then everything she had been told about the enemy might be a lie. And that was more dangerous than any weapon. The following night, the air was unusually still. Crickets hummed beyond the wire, and the barracks glowed faintly under lantern light. The women settled uneasily into their bunks, while the soldiers unrolled their bedding on the floor as always. But one soldier, young, broad-shouldered, with sandy hair, did something unexpected. As he loosened his pack, he pulled out a small leather wallet. Instead of tucking it safely beneath his gear, he set it openly on the floor beside his bedroll. The Japanese women saw it instantly. Their eyes widened. A wallet, personal, valuable, filled perhaps with money or photographs, left within reach of captives? It was unthinkable. Their own officers would have beaten them for such carelessness. The soldier seemed unconcerned. He stretched, muttered something to his comrade, and lay down with his arm over his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing slowed into sleep. Whispers rippled through the bunks. "It must be a trick," one woman hissed. Another shook her head, watching the wallet glint faintly in the lantern light. None dared touch it, yet all felt the weight of what it meant. Trust, or at least the appearance of it. The nurse could not look away. She imagined reaching for it, imagined the soldier springing awake to punish her. But no such thing happened. He slept deeply, unafraid, as though confident none of them would betray his carelessness. That gesture unsettled her more than any rifle. It suggested that these men did not see the women as enemies waiting to strike, but as humans capable of restraint. When morning came, the wallet was still there. The soldier picked it up casually, flipping it open to glance at something inside before tucking it back into his pack. For the briefest second, the nurse glimpsed a photograph. 2 children smiling, their faces soft with innocence. Her chest tightened. This enemy, this soldier, carried reminders of home just as she did in her memory. Family, siblings, people to protect. He was not only a guard, he was someone's son, someone's father, perhaps. The realization spread like a whisper among the women. The Americans were not only captors. They were men who trusted, who remembered, who carried pieces of love in their pockets. That night marked a turning point. No one said it aloud, but every prisoner felt it. The invisible wall had cracked further, not through words, but through the simple, terrifying power of trust. And once trust entered the barracks, even in small gestures, nothing could make the world inside those walls feel the same again. It happened on a night heavy with rain. Water drummed steadily on the barracks roof, filling the air with a dull, soothing rhythm. The women huddled under their blankets, listening, while the soldiers shifted restlessly on their bedrolls. The nurse lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams when she heard it. English, soft and uncertain, spoken closer than usual. A soldier was sitting upright, glancing toward the bunks. At first, she thought he was speaking to another guard. But then his words, halting and broken, reached her clearly. "You... safe." No harm, the Japanese women froze. They understood little English, but those words were unmistakable. Safe. No harm. Their breaths caught in unison. The soldier hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. He seemed almost embarrassed, as if unsure whether they had understood. Then, in a quieter voice, he added, "Sleep." "Okay." The nurse's heart pounded. No one moved. Then, to her astonishment, the oldest woman among them gave the slightest nod, clutching her blanket tighter. The soldier exhaled softly, as though relieved, and lay back down. The silence that followed was unlike any other night. It was no longer suffocating, no longer filled with suspicion. It was heavy with the echo of words that could not be taken back. The nurse turned her head toward the soldier's shadow. She had braced herself for cruelty, for threats, for humiliation. Instead, she had been given reassurance. The dissonance was almost unbearable. Whispers spread once the lights dimmed. "Did you hear?" one woman murmured. Another whispered, "He said we are safe." Their voices trembled with disbelief, as though speaking the words might break the spell. The nurse stayed silent, her chest tight. She did not trust easily. But the words echoed in her mind nonetheless. Safe. No harm. For years she had believed capture meant shame, dishonor, death of the spirit. Yet here she was, being told by the enemy himself that she could rest. She closed her eyes, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. But in the end, sleep came more easily than it ever had in captivity. Because for the first time, the silence of the barracks carried not only suspicion, but the fragile beginnings of trust. Days passed, but it was the nights that changed most. What had once been unbearable silence, filled with suspicion, slowly transformed into something else. The women still clung to their blankets, still avoided eye contact with the soldiers lying only feet away. But the tension no longer vibrated like a drawn bowstring. It softened, thread by thread. They began to notice details, how the Americans always turned their backs when the women changed into their camp-issued clothes, how one soldier coughed quietly in the night, muffling the sound as if not to disturb them. The younger girls whispered about it in the dark. "They are not like what we were told." The nurse listened but said nothing. Yet even she felt the slow erosion of fear. One evening, a soldier set his rifle aside before lying down, resting it deliberately against the far wall. The gesture was unmistakable. It said, "I am not here to threaten you tonight." The women exchanged glances, their eyes wide. For warriors raised under Bushido, a weapon was a lifeline. To sleep without one was unthinkable. Yet the Americans did so with calm, even ease. Gradually, the women realized the soldiers' presence had an unexpected effect. They felt safer. Not from the Americans themselves, but from the unknown. Outside the wire, the night held dangers, storms, hunger, perhaps even other men who might not follow rules. Inside, with these particular guards sleeping beside them, there was order, predictability, even kindness. The nurse, lying on her narrow cot, found herself watching the rise and fall of a soldier's chest as he slept. His face, relaxed in the dim light, looked younger than she had imagined, almost boyish. Her thoughts startled her. This was the enemy. Yet he had bandaged her arm. He had spoken the word safe. And now, in this strange companionship of silence, he was simply another human being breathing through the night. Whispers of dreams followed. One woman admitted she dreamed of home less now, and of the camp more. Another confessed that the sound of Americans snoring comforted her, because it meant the men were human, not monsters. The nurse kept her own silence, but in her heart she knew something dangerous had begun. Trust, fragile and uninvited, was taking root. By the time the lights flickered out that night, the boundaries between prisoner and guard, enemy and protector, had blurred just enough for both sides to feel it. They were not equals, they were not friends, but they were no longer strangers either. Morning light spilled through the thin cracks of the barracks, painting pale stripes across the floor. The women stirred first, adjusting blankets that still smelled faintly of soap and smoke. For a moment, they forgot where they were. The warmth, the quiet, the rhythm of steady breathing around them, it felt almost like home. But then they saw the rifles stacked against the wall, the uniforms draped on nearby bunks, and the truth returned. The Americans rose slowly, stretching sore shoulders and rubbing at tired eyes. Their movements were simple, unthreatening, almost domestic. No harsh orders, no barked commands, just men waking to another day. The women exchanged glances again. Something unspoken lingered between them. They had survived another night, not in fear, but in uneasy peace. The nurse, her arm still bandaged with the medic's careful work, found herself whispering a single word under her breath. Alive. She hadn't realized until now that she'd stopped expecting to survive each day. But here she was, alive, fed, and even safe. The soldiers, too, noticed the change. They no longer saw eyes filled only with suspicion. There were flickers of curiosity now, even recognition. One soldier nodded at a woman as she sat up, and though she did not reply, she did not look away either. Breakfast was called. As the women moved in line, one of the guards muttered quietly to another, "They're starting to trust us." The words carried a weight he did not fully understand. For the women, the shock was not that the Americans had slept beside them. It was that the world had not collapsed because of it. Their honor was intact, their bodies unharmed, their dignity strangely preserved. This realization was more disruptive than any cruelty could have been. Cruelty would have confirmed the stories they were told. Kindness challenged them. When the nurse sat with her breakfast tray, she looked down at the eggs and bread, then at the men who guarded them, then at her own hands. The world she had believed in before captivity was dissolving, piece by piece. The Americans did not see this turmoil. For them, it was just another morning in another camp. But for the women, dawn had brought more than light. It had brought questions that would never leave them. How could enemies show such humanity? And if they were not monsters, then what did that make the war? The answers would not come that day, nor in the days to follow. But the memory of those nights, when American soldiers slept beside them, not as conquerors but as men, would linger forever.